The pen scratched across the paper. A sound Preston Hall had come to associate with order. 3 months overdue, no collateral. The schoolhouse lease lay spread across his mahogany desk, the morning light through clean windows making the numbers perfectly clear. He signed his name at the bottom of the foreclosure notice with the same deliberate precision he brought to every business transaction. The ink dried quickly in the dry Wyoming air. "Mr. Hall," his bookkeeper appeared in the doorway, a folder of quarterly reports in hand. "About the schoolhouse matter, business is business to Thomas." Preston filed the foreclosure notice into its designated envelope. "Sentiment doesn't pay debts." "Yes, sir. Just thought I'd mention the building's been serving 30 children, railroad families mostly." Preston looked up, his expression unchanged. "And if I make exceptions for one lease, where does it end?" "Standards exist for a reason." Thomas nodded and retreated. Preston returned to the quarterly reports, already thinking about next month's projections. The bank had grown 15% since January. By year's end, he'd have enough capital to expand operations into Cheyenne. The door burst open. His daughter Emma rushed in, her school satchel bouncing against her hip. "Papa, we're learning about westward expansion today. Miss Bennett says the railroad changed everything." Preston barely glanced up from the columns of numbers. "Did you practice your arithmetic like I asked?" "Yes, sir. All my multiplication tables through 12. Good girl. Education requires discipline." He made a notation in the margin of a loan application. "Run along now. I've work to finish." Emma hesitated at the door. "Papa, when will you come visit my school? Miss Bennett says families are welcome any time." "Perhaps someday." He waved her away gently. "Close the door behind you." The room fell silent again except for the scratch of his pen. Preston reviewed 3 more loan applications. Approved 2. Denied 1. Everything in its proper place. Everything according to established principles. He folded the foreclosure notice into the envelope and sealed it with wax. The building was worth more empty than leased. He could sell it to the railroad for storage. Perhaps warehouse space, a better return on investment than collecting late payments from families who couldn't manage their finances. Preston set the envelope aside for the morning post and opened his ledger to the current month's accounts. The numbers aligned perfectly. Each column balanced. Each transaction recorded with care. This was how the world worked. This was how prosperity was built. The pen scratched on. Outside, the spring sun climbed higher over the Wyoming Territory, warming the mud-thick streets. Preston Hall sat at his desk, confident in his righteousness. Blind to the contradictions building like storm clouds on a clear horizon. Clara Bennett climbed the steps to Hall First National Bank shortly after 10 o'clock. Her worn teaching primer clutched against her chest like a shield. 29 years old in a dress she'd mended so many times the original fabric was more memory than material. But her back was straight, her chin level. The bank's interior smelled of furniture polish and tobacco. Preston Hall sat behind his desk reviewing documents, barely acknowledging her entrance until she cleared her throat. "Mr. Hall, thank you for seeing me." He gestured to the chair across from him without looking up. "Miss Bennett, I assume this is about the lease." Clara sat, setting her primer on the edge of his desk. "I'm asking for 3 months' extension. The railroad workers' families have promised contributions after spring work begins. By June, we'll have the full amount." Preston finally met her eyes. "You're already 3 months in arrears. Adding 3 more creates 6 months of unpaid obligation. The families want to pay. The winter was difficult. Illness, reduced work hours." "Miss Bennett," Preston's voice remained calm, almost kind. "I understand your situation is unfortunate, but maintaining standards prevents future complications. If I extend your lease on promises, I'd need to extend every delinquent account. The system would collapse." Clara's hands tightened on the primer. 30 children attend school. Mr. Hall, ages 5 to 14, the nearest school is 40 miles south. "I'm aware of the school's enrollment." Preston pulled a different folder from his desk drawer. "I've reviewed the property carefully. The building has potential value to other enterprises. The railroad has expressed interest. For storage, for commerce, which creates jobs. Miss Bennett, Jobs that allow families to pay their obligations. She studied his face, looking for some crack in his certainty. Found only polished stone. Business is business. Mr. Hall. Exactly. He seemed pleased she understood. Clara stood, collecting her primer. And children are children. Thank you for your time. She walked to the door with the same careful dignity she'd entered with. Preston watched her go, feeling a brief flutter of unease somewhere beneath his ribs. He dismissed it quickly. Returning to his documents, the foreclosure stood. The decision was sound. The principles were clear. Outside, Clara paused on the wooden sidewalk, letting the spring sun warm her face. She'd expected his refusal, but hope was a stubborn thing. She straightened her shoulders and walked toward the schoolhouse, where 30 children waited for her to teach them that education mattered, that knowledge had value, that the world contained more than ledgers and debt. Behind her, Preston Hall's pen continued its methodical scratch across paper, recording transactions. Calculating interest, building his empire one balance column at a time. Emma Hall saw the notice first, nailed to the schoolhouse door like a wanted poster. The black text stood stark against the weathered wood. She traced the words with her finger, pronouncing them slowly. Eviction notice. The door opened. Miss Bennett appeared, saw what Emma was reading, and her expression did something Emma had never seen before. Not quite sadness, not quite fear. Something older than both. Come inside, dear. Quickly now, before you catch cold. The classroom fell silent as Miss Bennett stood before them. 30 faces watching, waiting. Tommy Fisher in the front row, Sarah Mitchell, who walked 4 miles each way, the Brennan twins, Emma's best friend Mary, all of them sensing the change before words gave it shape. Children, Miss Bennett's voice stayed steady. The schoolhouse lease has ended. We'll continue lessons through month's end, but then school will close. Questions erupted. Where would they go? What about their readers? What about graduation for the older students? Miss Bennett raised her hand for quiet. I don't have all the answers yet, but I promise you this: every single one of you will leave here with something that belongs to you forever, something no one can take away. Emma didn't understand the promise, but she understood the finality. School was ending. Miss Bennett was leaving. Everything was changing. That evening, she confronted her father in his study. He sat reviewing papers, his desk lamp creating a warm circle of light against the gathering darkness. Papa, can't you stop the eviction? Miss Bennett says school is closing. Preston looked up, surprised by the intensity in his daughter's voice. Emma, we've discussed this. Business obligations must be honored. The lease is overdue. But what about the children? Your education will continue. I'll arrange private tutoring, better instruction, more personalized attention. Emma's hands clenched at her sides. I don't want private tutoring. I want my school. I want my friends. I want Miss Bennett. The world operates on principles. Emma, sentiment cannot override sound business practices. He returned to his papers, considering the matter settled. When you're older, you'll understand. Tommy's father saves pennies to buy him readers. Sarah walks 4 miles through snow. Don't they deserve to learn too? That's not my responsibility. Preston's voice gained an edge of irritation. I'm responsible for you, your future, your opportunities. Emma stared at her father as if seeing him for the first time, seeing someone she didn't quite recognize, didn't quite understand. She turned and walked to her room without another word. Preston listened to her footsteps fade down the hall. He felt the sting of her disapproval but pushed it aside. She was 10 years old, too young to understand economics. Community obligations, the harsh realities of frontier business. He was protecting her future. That's what mattered. In her room, Emma lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about Miss Bennett's face when she'd read that notice, thinking about Tommy and Sarah and all the others, thinking about her father sitting in his study, surrounded by his papers and his principles, completely alone. The advocacy began at breakfast. Papa, did you know Miss Bennett buys slates for children whose families can't afford them? Preston buttered his toast. That's very generous of her. At dinner, Tommy Fisher learned to read this year. His whole family learned from his primers. One child's education helping everyone. Education has ripple effects. Yes, during their evening walk. Sarah Mitchell wants to be a teacher when she grows up, just like Miss Bennett. Preston stopped, turning to face his daughter. Emma, I understand you're upset, but this manipulation needs to end. The foreclosure stands. It's not manipulation. Papa, it's just true. Then why do you bring it up constantly? Emma looked up at him with her mother's eyes. Because I don't understand how you can say education matters and then close a school. I'm not closing anything. I'm enforcing a contract. What's the difference? Preston had no immediate answer. He resumed walking, but jaw tight. The world isn't simple, Emma. Principles matter. Standards matter. Without them, everything falls apart. Miss Bennett says kindness matters too. Miss Bennett doesn't run a bank. They walked the rest of the way in silence. Preston congratulated himself on ending the argument, on maintaining his position. Emma said nothing more about the school that evening, but at dinner the next night, Papa, what principle says children shouldn't learn to read? Preston set down his fork. That's not what I said. But it's what's happening. Due to unfortunate circumstances yes, but I didn't create those circumstances. I'm simply responding to them according to established business practices. Emma pushed her food around her plate. Miss Bennett says every choice we make teaches something. What does this choice teach? That actions have consequences, that agreements must be honored. That money matters more than people. Preston's patience fractured. Enough. You're a child. You don't understand economics, finance, or community sustainability. When you're older, I'm not a child. Emma's voice stayed quiet but firm. I'm old enough to see what's happening. You just don't want me to. She excused herself from the table, leaving her plate half full. Preston sat alone in the dining room, his own appetite gone. The house felt larger somehow, emptier. He told himself Emma would understand eventually. She'd see the wisdom in maintaining principles, in refusing to let sentiment override sound judgment. She'd thank him someday for teaching her the difference between feeling and thinking. He almost believed it. 2 weeks before the scheduled closure, Emma made her announcement. They sat in Preston's study, Emma perched on the chair across from his desk like she'd done since childhood. But something was different now. She held herself differently, spoke differently. Papa, I need to tell you something I'm proud of. Preston looked up from his ledger, pleased by her tone. Perhaps she'd finally accepted the situation. What is it? Dear, Miss Bennett taught me how to teach. During recess, I help the younger students with their letters, just like she does. Emma's face glowed with pride. Tommy's little brother couldn't recognize his alphabet last month. Now he can write his whole name. Preston's pen stopped moving. You spend your recess time teaching? Yes, sir. Miss Bennett says the best way to learn something is to teach it. And it makes me feel good. Like I'm doing something important. The words landed like stones in the still water, ripples spreading outward. Preston stared at his daughter, seeing Clara Bennett's philosophy reflected in her face. Service without calculation, giving without expectation of return, community before self. Everything his foreclosure policy rejected. Emma, he chose his words carefully, why do you waste your playtime on teaching? She looked confused. It's not wasting. Papa, it's helping. But you could be playing, enjoying your childhood. I am enjoying it. Helping people feels good. She leaned forward. Ernest, don't you feel good when you help people? Preston opened his mouth to say yes. Of course, naturally, but the words caught in his throat. When had he last helped someone without calculating the return? When had he given without measuring the cost? My work helps people, he said finally. The bank provides capital for businesses, loans for homes, financial stability for the community. But you're taking away our school. I'm enforcing a contract. Emma studied him, and Preston saw his own stubbornness reflected back. Miss Bennett enforces things too. She makes us practice our letters until we get them right. But she does it because she cares if we learn. Do you care? Of course I care. You're my daughter. I mean about them, about Tommy and Sarah and everyone else. Preston had no answer. Emma watched him struggle, then stood quietly. "Good night, Papa." After she left, Preston sat alone with his ledger. The numbers marched across the pages in neat columns, balanced and precise. Assets, liabilities, interest calculations, everything logical, everything justified. But for the first time in his banking career, the numbers felt hollow. He tried to return to his work, to lose himself in the familiar comfort of financial certainty. But Emma's question echoed in the silence. "Do you care?" He closed the ledger without finishing his calculations. Outside, the spring darkness pressed against the windows. Somewhere across town, lamplight burned in the schoolhouse where Clara Bennett prepared tomorrow's lessons, where his daughter had learned that giving mattered more than taking. Preston sat in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his prosperity, and felt something he couldn't quite name, something that felt uncomfortably like doubt. The final week arrived with unseasonable warmth. Preston watched from his office window as the community gathered around the schoolhouse like neighbors around a dying fire. The Watson family from the eastern homesteads arrived with a box of supplies. The Mitchells brought firewood they couldn't spare. Railroad workers stopped by after their shifts, pressing coins into Clara Bennett's hands. Too little, too late, but the gesture filled the schoolyard with quiet solidarity. Preston observed it all from his second-floor vantage point, telling himself they were being impractical, emotional. If they'd managed their finances properly, this situation wouldn't exist, but their unity unsettled him. Thomas knocked on his door. "Mr. Hall, the quarterly reports are ready." "Good. Leave them on my desk." His bookkeeper hesitated. "My children attended that school." "Sir, learn to read there." "Both of them." Preston looked up sharply. "I'm aware of the school's history. Just thought you should know." Thomas set down the reports and left. The comment stung more than Preston wanted to admit. Even Thomas, his loyal employee, carried quiet reproach in his voice. That evening, Emma announced Miss Bennett's plans for a farewell day. Each student would receive something special, a gift to remember their time together. "You should come, Papa. Miss Bennett says families are welcome." Preston felt a trap closing. "I have a full schedule that day. Please." Emma's voice carried a weight beyond her years. "I want you to see what you're taking away. Emma, just come, please." He found himself agreeing before he'd fully considered the implications. Emma's face brightened with hope, and Preston immediately regretted the promise, but backing out now would damage something fragile between them. The week crawled toward Friday. Preston tried to focus on his work, but his attention kept drifting to that window, to the schoolhouse visible in the distance. Each evening, lamplight burned there long past dark. Clara Bennett preparing for the end, 30 children losing their only access to education. Thursday evening, Preston stood at his window as dusk settled over the territory. The schoolhouse glowed like a lantern against the darkening sky, warm, inviting, full of something he'd never quite experienced: community, connection, shared purpose beyond profit. He turned away from the window, returning to his desk. But the ledger's familiar comfort had vanished, the numbers blurred together. Meaningless scratches on paper. Tomorrow he would fulfill his promise to Emma. He would cross that threshold, enter that building, witness what his foreclosure had destroyed. Part of him already knew the visit would change everything. Part of him wished he'd never agreed to go, but the promise was made. And Preston Hall honored his commitments, even when they led him places he didn't want to face. Preston Hall crossed the schoolhouse threshold at 2 o'clock Friday afternoon and stepped into a world he'd never understood. The building was humble, rough pine benches worn smooth by children's restless shifting, a potbelly stove in the corner, its paint chipped and faded. Clara Bennett's careful handwriting covered the chalkboard arithmetic problems, vocabulary words, a quote from Emerson about education being the kindling of a flame. 30 children sat in solemn rows, their Sunday clothes carefully pressed. Parents and siblings lined the walls, the room crowded with witnesses to an ending. Preston found space near the back, trying to make himself small. Emma spotted him and smiled, but her eyes held something older than childhood, a knowing that made him uncomfortable. Clara Bennett stood before her students holding a cloth sack. She wore the same mended dress she'd worn to his office, but her bearing made it seem regal. "Children," her voice carried to every corner, "when I came to this schoolhouse 3 years ago, I made you a promise that you would leave here with something no one could take away. Today, I keep that promise." She reached into the sack and withdrew a small, bound book, hand-stitched pages, careful lettering on the cover. "Tommy Fisher." The boy stood, trembling slightly. Clara placed the book in his hands. "Your gift for numbers showed me that intelligence comes in many forms. This arithmetic primer was copied just for you. The problems inside will challenge you for years to come." She touched his shoulder. "Keep learning. Tommy, the world needs minds like yours." Tommy clutched the book to his chest, tears streaming down his face. His father's expression reflected equal parts pride and grief. Clara continued. Each name called, each book presented. Poetry for Sarah Mitchell, frontier stories for the Brennan twins. History for young Jacob Lewis, who asked endless questions about the East. Preston watched the ink-stained fingers that had labored by lamplight to create these gifts. Clara Bennett had nothing her own financial crisis unresolved, yet she'd spent weeks and her last dollars giving these children something permanent. The books piled up in small hands. Personal words for each student. "You have courage. Your reading voice brings stories alive. Never stop asking questions." Finally, Emma Hall, Preston's daughter, walked forward, and Preston saw Clara's expression soften further. Emma received her book with both hands, opening it to see her favorite stories copied in Clara's precise script. "You have a teacher's heart. Emma, don't lose it." Clara embraced her, and Preston watched his daughter cling to this woman who'd shaped her more profoundly than he'd realized. Emma whispered something too quiet for Preston to hear. Clara nodded, wiping her own eyes. The ceremony concluded. Children and parents clustered around Clara, trying to express gratitude that words couldn't hold. Preston stood frozen against the wall, something breaking inside his chest. He'd seen the hours in those books, the money Clara didn't have spent on paper and binding, the personal attention given to each child, knowing exactly what they needed, what would serve them best. He'd called this a financial transaction, a simple foreclosure, an enforcement of contractual obligations. But he'd been wrong, completely, catastrophically wrong. This wasn't about money. It had never been about money. Preston left before the ceremony ended, unable to bear another moment. He walked back to his office through the warm afternoon, Clara Bennett's dignity following him like a shadow, her hands presenting those books, her ink-stained fingers, her giving from absolute scarcity while he took from abundance in his office. He sat at his desk surrounded by his ledgers, his balanced accounts, his quarterly reports showing 15% growth, and felt more impoverished than he'd ever imagined possible. Late that night, Preston sat alone in his study, the lamp burning low. His ledger lay open before him, but the numbers swam together like fish in murky water, meaningless, hollow. He'd built everything on sand. The door creaked. Emma appeared in her nightgown, her hand-copied book clutched against her chest. She crossed to his desk without speaking, settling into the chair across from him. They sat in silence for a long time. The lamplight flickered. Outside, the spring night pressed against the windows. Finally, Emma spoke. "Papa, why does money matter more than education?" Preston opened his mouth to answer, to explain about economic principles, about sustainability, about the necessity of maintaining standards. Nothing came out. He tried again. "Emma, it's complicated. Business requires, it's not complicated." Her voice stayed soft but certain. "Miss Bennett has nothing, and she gave us everything. You have everything, and you took away our school. That's not complicated. That's just wrong. I was enforcing a contract. You were being cruel." The word landed like a slap. Preston recoiled. "I'm not cruel. Everything I do to protect your future, to give you opportunities, by destroying other children's opportunities. That's not I didn't intend." Preston struggled, every justification crumbling before it reached his lips. Business principles exist for good reasons. What principle says children shouldn't learn? None. But financial obligations. Miss Bennett had financial obligations too. She still gave. Emma held up her book. She spent weeks making these, her own money for the paper. Hours every night writing by lamplight, while you counted money by gaslight. Preston had no answer. His daughter sat across from him, 10 years old, seeing through every defense he'd constructed, seeing the truth he'd avoided for months. I don't know, he admitted finally. The words came out barely above a whisper. I don't know why money mattered more. I thought I was being responsible, principled, but I think I was just being afraid. Afraid of what? Preston looked at his ledger, at the columns of numbers that had given him certainty for 30 years. Afraid of losing control, afraid that if I showed mercy once, everything would fall apart, afraid of being seen as weak. Emma studied him with eyes too old for her face. Miss Bennett isn't weak. No. Preston's voice cracked. She's the strongest person I've ever met. Emma stood. Crossing to his side, she kissed his forehead like she used to when she was small. Good night. Papa, I hope you figure out what to do. She left. Taking her book with her, Preston sat alone again, the silence heavier than before. His prosperity existed because the community thrived. The railroad workers who deposited wages, the ranchers who took loans for equipment. The families who trusted him with their futures, and he'd repaid that trust by destroying the institution that made their children literate, capable, prepared for the world. Preston closed his ledger. The numbers that had sustained him for 3 decades suddenly felt like chains. He'd built his fortune on extraction, on taking, on accumulation without consideration of cost. Clara Bennett had taught him a different kind of accounting, one measured in transformed lives, in knowledge passed forward, in communities strengthened through shared purpose. He didn't have her strength, her generosity, her vision, but perhaps he could learn. Perhaps it wasn't too late to calculate value differently. Preston sat in the darkness long after the lamp burned out, feeling the foundations of his certainty crumble into dust, feeling the terrible freedom of admitting he'd been wrong, feeling, for the first time in years, the possibility of becoming something better than he was. Saturday morning found Preston Hall standing on the schoolhouse steps, the lease documents folded in his jacket pocket. The building looked different in daylight, not an asset to be liquidated, but a sacred space where futures were built. He knocked. Clara Bennett answered, wariness flickering across her face. Mr. Hall, Miss Bennett, may I come in? She stepped aside. The schoolhouse felt larger, empty. The benches pushed against the walls. The chalkboard erased. Clara had already begun dismantling her classroom. Preston withdrew the documents. I'm returning the building to you, not as a lease extension, as a permanent community trust. The deed will transfer to a board of local families. No more rent, no more foreclosure threats. Clara stared at the papers. I don't understand. I'm also establishing an education fund, 10% of the bank's annual profits, dedicated to frontier schools, teachers' salaries, supplies, building maintenance. He met her eyes. It's not charity, Miss Bennett. It's investment. A community's strength determines its prosperity. I forgot that. Your students reminded me. Why now? Preston thought of Emma's question, of those hand-copied books, of Clara's ink-stained fingers giving from scarcity. Because my daughter asked me something I couldn't answer, why money mattered more than education. I realized I'd built my whole life on the wrong foundation. Clara took the documents, her hands shaking slightly. This doesn't erase what happened. No, it doesn't. Preston felt the full weight of his choices, but it prevents it from happening again. The bank succeeds when the community succeeds. I should have understood that from the beginning. What changed your mind truly? Preston remembered the ceremony. 30 children receiving gifts from a woman who had nothing, the dignity in her giving, the love in every hand-copied page. I attended the farewell ceremony. I watched you give those books away, and I realized you understood something I'd spent 30 years avoiding, that wealth isn't measured in ledgers. It's measured in lives changed, in knowledge passed forward, in communities built through generosity rather than extraction. Clara studied him for a long moment. Then she extended her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Hall." They shook hands across the divide that separated their philosophies, not erasing it, but bridging it. Two ways of measuring value finding common ground. Emma appeared in the doorway. Having followed her father from home, she looked between them, understanding passing across her young face. "Does this mean school continues?" she asked. Clara smiled. "Yes, Emma, school continues." Emma ran to hug Miss Bennett, then turned to her father. Preston saw something in her expression he hadn't seen in weeks. Not quite forgiveness, not quite trust restored, but the beginning of both. They walked home together through the spring morning, mother and daughter, the distance between them slightly smaller than before. That afternoon, Preston sat at his desk, his ledger open before him. Same office, same mahogany desk, same view of the schoolhouse through the window, but everything had changed. He opened a new page, writing carefully across the top Frontier Education Fund. Below it, the first entry, 10% of last quarter's profits. Designated for teacher salaries and school supplies, the pen scratched across paper. The sound that had marked his life for 3 decades, but now it wrote restoration instead of foreclosure, investment instead of extraction, community building instead of community taking. Through his window, he saw lamplight appear in the schoolhouse as evening approached. Clara Bennett preparing for Monday's lessons. 30 children who would return to their benches, their primers, their futures. Emma sat nearby, reading from her hand-copied book. She looked up, catching her father's eye, and smiled. Preston smiled back. The numbers in his ledger looked different now, still precise, still balanced, but serving life instead of merely counting it. Outside, the Wyoming spring deepened toward summer. The territory stretched vast and unforgiving as always. But inside one small schoolhouse, knowledge passed from teacher to student, generation to generation, building futures one lesson at a time. And in his office above the bank, Preston Hall learned a different kind of accounting, one measured in transformed lives and strengthened communities, one that recognized prosperity's true foundation, not what he could take, but what he chose to give. The pen scratched on, but now it wrote redemption.